Hi, Rob Lamberton here. I've been remarkably healthy for most of my life. I've exercised intensely for decades. I've always paid close attention to my nutrition, supplementation, and my own physiology. But about 4 years ago, I started seeing something I hadn't really experienced before. My health was beginning to change. My systolic blood pressure, which had never been an issue, started getting up into the 150s. My hemoglobin A1C crept up to 5.9, which is pre diabetic. Then I started to develop gastrointestinal problems, abdominal discomfort, excessive gas, and other symptoms that told me something wasn't right. And then I knew there was a problem. But what I eventually discovered was that this wasn't hadn't started just 4 years earlier. The story went back for decades. Now, I've experienced an extraordinary amount of physical trauma during my life. If you can believe it, I've actually been involved in 13 motor vehicle accidents. I also sustained an occipital right skull fracture and brain injury when I was in high school. And my second car accident caused an upper cervical problem involving my atlas that led to years of severe musculoskeletal pain. And when I say severe, I mean pain virtually every waking hour. I couldn't sit down for more than about 20 minutes. And eventually, I required opioid medication for the pain, which I remained on for about 10 years. I gotta tell you, I hated every single day of it. And perhaps one of the most devastating things for me personally was that I had to stop exercising. And that's because exercise has always been part of my identity and my physiology for virtually my entire life. I've also experienced approximately 20 years of disrupted sleep architecture. In addition to that, there were major psychological and emotional stressors as well. Because of the car accidents, I went through a period of severe PTSD lasting about 6 years, which I eventually resolved using direct neurofeedback. And immediately before the deterioration of my health, I had been through a physically and emotionally abusive relationship. Now, individually, these can look like completely different events: a brain injury, chronic musculoskeletal pain, sleep disruption, loss of exercise, long term opioid use, PTSD, emotional trauma, and eventually blood pressure changes, worsening glucose regulation, and gastrointestinal symptoms. But physiology doesn't experience your life as a collection of unrelated diagnoses. It experiences the cumulative load. Now, fortunately, something happened at almost exactly the right time. I was beginning my training in functional diagnostic nutrition. Now, as part of that training, we performed the functional laboratory testing on ourselves, and we worked through the findings with a mentor. So I suddenly had an opportunity to look under my own hood, as it were. And when those results came back, a much bigger pattern became visible. And one of the major findings involved my stress hormone physiology, particularly cortisol and DHEA, and the relationship between them. What emerged was evidence of a substantially dysregulated cortisol to DHEA relationship and a physiology that had shifted toward a much more catabolic state. And suddenly, some things that had appeared unrelated began making considerably more sense, because prolonged dysregulation doesn't necessarily remain confined to one system. It can influence metabolic regulation, it can affect immune function, it can interact with gastrointestinal and mucosal physiology. And when we looked at the rest of my functional testing, including my gastrointestinal testing, we began seeing downstream pieces of that picture as well. That's what I'm going to talk to you about as I walk through this series. Not because I think everyone with high blood pressure, an elevated hemoglobin A1C, or gut problems has the same physiology I had. They certainly don't. That's actually one of the most important points. People are going to have different physiological aspects. I'm going to show you what happened in my case, what the testing revealed, what we did about it, and why the intervention worked so well for me. And along the way, I'm going to explain cortisol and DHEA, catabolic physiology, immune regulation, gastrointestinal function, functional laboratory testing, and how apparently unrelated symptoms can sometimes be connected at a systems level. Because this experience eventually changed the way I think about health. Today, when I work with someone, I'm not interested in only asking, what's the symptom? I want to understand, what is the physiological environment producing that symptom, and what else is happening in the system at the same time? That's a more important consideration. Now, in the next video, I'll start with one of the most important things we discovered in my testing. What had happened to my cortisol and DHEA, and what that told us about the physiological cost of the previous decades. So, if you've been dealing with health problems that seem unrelated, or you've been told your tests look reasonably normal, even though you know you don't feel right, follow along. I think you'll find the information quite informative, and you may recognize some of your own story in mine. So thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you very soon in my next video. Rob Lamberton here.